My name is Tara, and I want to tell you a story that began when I was still a small child. I must have been about 5 or 6 years old when my parents separated. My dad, whose name was Mark, couldn't take it anymore. He was drained, emotionally broken, exhausted from the endless accusations and contempt from my mom, Linda. Mom. She was a woman with a strong personality, always striving for more. She would berate him for not making enough money, belittle him, making him feel worthless. I remember one time when Dad came home, beaming, full of joy, with praise at work that promised him a promotion. He was grinning from ear to ear, as if the whole world were at his feet. In that moment, I saw him through the eyes of a child, and he was my hero, a hero who had achieved something important. But Mom just looked at him with such indifferent cruelty that I could almost feel the light in the room dimming. Her words didn't sound like support, they were cold, destructive. "Ah, so you finally got a decent job," she said, without a trace of joy or empathy. It was in that moment I understood that nothing he did was ever enough for her. She couldn't grasp what that success meant to him. And that look, empty and icy, as if she had just ripped his heart out, leaving only an empty shell. Over time, he left. I can't say I blame him. As I grew older, I realized that perhaps that moment was the beginning of his departure, not just physically, but emotionally as well. But at that moment, as I stood in front of the closed door, watching him leave, everything around me seemed impossibly vast, complicated, and unjust. Although my mom was upset, she quickly realized that being a poor, single mother was no reason to feel sorry for herself. On the contrary, a whole world of possibilities opened up to her. Soon, she began an affair with one of her colleagues, Mr. Johnson. He was a supervisor, and she took full advantage of this to secure workplace perks, without shame or hesitation. I felt sorry that this was happening, but deep down, I even understood her. She was, in a way, surviving in a world where everyone tries to take advantage of each other, if not physically, then at least socially. I remember how she often went on business trips, and I was left home alone. Mom told Mr. Johnson that I was sick and needed to stay home. I didn't complain, although, to be honest, I felt uncomfortable about these false excuses. But I didn't dare protest. I was too young to understand all the nuances, but old enough to sense that my life was built on lies. I spent many mornings like that, sitting in front of the TV, watching cartoons, and feeling like an adult who knows better than to argue with something you can't change. Mom would dress up, do her makeup, and fix her hair, preparing for yet another important business meeting. And every time I tried to say something, she would tell me, "Don't worry, it's none of your business." I didn't understand then that it actually was my business, because the world I was growing up in didn't seem so simple. Mom always found a way out of any situation, but the cost of that was high. One day, when the latest child support check from my dad arrived, the money he sent for alimony, Mom laughed, waving it in front of my face like a mirror reflecting her demeaning judgment. "Look, your father thinks this pitiful amount is enough to raise a poor excuse for a child." I could feel her words cutting into me, into my small world, filled with hurt and disappointment. At first, Mom would forget to wash my clothes, leaving me in a situation that became more unbearable with each passing day. I had nothing clean to wear to school, and every time I showed up in wrinkled, stained clothes, I could feel my face burn with shame. The other kids whispered behind my back, and I saw fingers pointing at me, as if I were the one who couldn't meet those simple but so important standards that everyone around me seemed to set. It was a small, yet cruel world, and I was part of it. Then came the issue with food. Mom always cooked elaborate meals for herself and for Richard, the very Richard who was just her latest lover. The house would fill with the mouth-watering scents of roasted meat and fragrant herbs, but when I, with a hungry look in my eyes, approached the table, she would start to fidget, as if she couldn't quite believe I wasn't supposed to be there. "Oh, Tara, sorry, I didn't cook enough for 3. Why don't you make yourself a sandwich?" she would say, offering a weak smile, not seeing me as someone deserving of a place at that table. And so, I would retreat to the kitchen, starving, clutching a slice of bread hastily spread with peanut butter and jelly, and begin chewing, as if that could not only satisfy my hunger but also swallow all the recent disappointments. My stomach would growl as I listened to Mom and Richard laughing at the table, hearing the clink of glasses and their laughter, which sharply contrasted with my meager dinner, almost inhuman in its banality. It felt like a knife twisting in my heart, but I didn't dare object or express my feelings. Everything was happening too quickly, too loudly, and I remained just an outsider, retreating into myself. The worst part was when Mom started meddling with my schoolwork. I would sit at the table for hours, rewriting, memorizing, spending every minute on assignments that seemed to yield no results. And then, the next morning, all my efforts would vanish, as if they had never existed at all. Mom always found some reason to take my notebooks, to fix something or redo it. As a result, I would show up to class empty-handed, and my teachers began to look at me with increasing concern. My grades started to slip, and the teachers exchanged worried glances, but no one ever figured out what was happening at home. Richard didn't notice anything. He was always absorbed in his work, and when he wasn't around, his attention was solely focused on Mom. She played the role of the adoring wife with such coyness, as if nothing could ever be expected of her except to fulfill that image. "Richard, darling, you work so hard, you deserve a little rest," Mom would say, massaging his shoulders, and that sweet smile of hers would spread across her face, the one she reserved only for him. He would smile in return, completely enchanted by her charms. "What would I do without you, Linda?" Richard would say, and there wasn't a trace of doubt in his voice. He was happy, and Mom continued to weave happiness for both of them, squeezing every last bit from his pocket. Everything got even worse when Mom announced that she was pregnant. Richard was over the moon with joy, while Mom did everything she could to extract as much as possible from the situation. The doctor said she needed more rest, and she used that as an excuse to distance herself even more from everything else. And I stayed on the sidelines, in that house where love was reserved for everyone but me, where care was for everyone but me. I heard Mom's voice from the kitchen, and despite the rising unease within me, I froze, bracing myself for a possible confrontation. It always seemed inevitable, like something was bound to happen, and at every moment I prepared myself to hear her start snapping at me. But when I turned around, my eyes met an unexpected expression on her face. Mom was standing in the doorway, her posture relaxed, and her face wore a strange smile, as if she had just rid herself of a burden she'd been carrying for years. I felt something stir inside me. "I'm going to live with Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm, with a strange note of relief. Her words froze me in place. Deep down, I knew it was inevitable, but even so, they hit me like a slap in the face, straight to the heart. Before I could respond, Mom added, "My boy is stronger than I am." She looked at me with such determination, as if searching my eyes for confirmation of her words, but I couldn't find the strength to say anything in return. Mom smiled then, and that smile was wide, even too wide to be sincere. I felt an abyss opening up before me, as if I had suddenly become a stranger in this place. "Okay," she continued, as if she didn't notice my thoughts at all, "it's the right time. Richard and I could use the extra space for the baby." Her words struck me like a blow to the chest. I barely held back my tears, but before I could say anything, I heard the sound of a car horn cutting through the silence, shaking my thoughts. It was Dad. He had arrived. Mom walked me to the door, and I noticed the uneasy smile that still lingered on her face. It was as if she didn't know how to react, but the words were simple. "Good luck, Tara," she said, forcing a smile. I felt as if I were being thrown into this world, left at a crossroads where there was no turning back. Mom waved at me from the door, and I couldn't help but notice how her joyful expression contrasted with what I was feeling inside. She was happy because I was leaving, because I was no longer part of her life. Dad was here, and everything seemed so simple, as if it were all unfolding according to a script already written. I got into his car, unable to tear my eyes away from the door where Mom stood, but not knowing what to say. She was happy. And I was supposed to be happy too. But honestly, I couldn't figure out what I was feeling. Dad's apartment was small, but it felt like a home, warm and cozy, unlike the place I had lived with Mom. It was calm here, simple, without unnecessary words or expectations. But I knew it was temporary. Dad was consumed by his work, and I watched with awe as his business rapidly grew, like a rocket taking off, leaving both him and me scrambling to keep up. Every week brought news of new contracts, big clients, expansions. Everything moved so fast, I could barely keep up. Soon, we began looking for a house. Not just any house, but a house in the most prestigious neighborhood in the city, a place where every detail was meticulously planned, where every step felt like a new achievement. We bought a 3-story house, a true masterpiece of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a huge backyard with a garden that could have been the cover feature of a trendy magazine. My room was twice the size of our entire old apartment. And although everything appeared perfect on the outside, I could feel how this luxury only heightened the emptiness that was slowly taking over me. Dad worked long hours, running a thriving business, and I was trying to find my place in this new world. He pulled me aside, his eyes shining with excitement. He had always been the one who, despite all the struggles, remained strong and confident, but in that moment, I saw something different in his eyes, as if he were worried about something important, something he needed to tell me. He handed me a small box, barely large enough to hold something that seemed so significant, as though it contained an entire world. I carefully opened the box, and inside, gleaming, was a key. "This is for your new apartment in the city center," he said, his voice filled with a special warmth. "Consider it a graduation gift." I couldn't hold back the tears that welled up in my eyes. How long I had waited to find my place, to create something of my own, something small, but mine. And now, with this key, with this gift, I felt like I was truly beginning my journey in this vast world. I hugged him tightly, thanking him, with a feeling that was hard to put into words. "Thank you, Dad, for everything," I whispered, and in that moment, it felt as though the whole world around us had stopped. A few years later, after graduating from college, my life finally began to fall into place. My career took off. I had a beautiful apartment in the city center, and it seemed like everything I had dreamed of was becoming a reality. From time to time, I allowed myself to pause and just watch how everything was unfolding. Dad and I had settled into a comfortable routine, weekly dinners, long phone calls, endless conversations that always ended with laughter and warmth. Everything was perfect, until the mistake came. One day, like a thunderbolt out of the blue, the news arrived: Dad had cancer. I couldn't believe it. The doctor was saying something about the stage of the disease, but I couldn't hear the details. All I could grasp was one thing: it was bad. That moment turned my world upside down, like turning a page in a book where you never expected to find those words. From that point on, my world shrank to one single purpose: to save Dad. I took a leave of absence from work and returned home to him. Every moment of my waking hours was devoted to his care. I studied every treatment option, consulted specialists, looked for alternative methods that could give us even the slightest chance. The months turned into a brutal cycle of hope and despair. Every good day, when Dad felt strong enough to go out into the garden or eat with us at the table, felt like a gift from fate. But for every good day, there were 3 bad ones, days filled with pain and nausea from the endless procedures that drained his strength. One day, as I was helping him back into bed after a particularly difficult day, he turned to me with a serious look. His face was pale from exhaustion, and his voice barely came out, like a whisper. "Tara," he said, and I could feel that in his words there was not just a request, but a heavy burden of emotions. "I need you. Promise me something." I nodded, unable to speak a word. A lump in my throat made it impossible to speak, but I knew this was the moment when I had to do something important for him, to show him that I was there, that I would be with him until the end. "Promise me," he repeated, his gaze growing even more insistent. A tear involuntarily slid down my cheek as I barely managed to say, "I promise, Dad, that I'll be with you, that I'll do everything to make sure you know you're not alone." That promise became my most important, my only promise. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just opened a door I should have kept tightly closed. But from the moment Dad passed away, Mom became the only family I had left. All those years spent in the shadow of her indifference couldn't overshadow the fact that she, the only blood relative I had, was the one who, albeit belatedly, stepped back into my life. Mom arrived at the funeral home an hour after our call with my half-brother Thomas. He was still a child, about 13, tall and awkward, with hands that couldn't even hold the simplest thing he was asked to. I watched as Mom fussed over him, adjusting his tie, smoothing down his hair, leaning toward him with that persistent care she had once denied me. It felt like a knife to the stomach, as though I were being wounded over and over again, unable to forget how much I had lacked that love as a child. I stood there, watching this scene unfold, and I could feel myself torn apart by the pain. Mom showered Thomas with the attention I had been denied, as if all those years of constant dissatisfaction and humiliation were nothing more than a forgotten past. It was strange, impossible to comprehend, and I couldn't understand what had come over her. Why had she suddenly become so gentle, so attentive? What had changed in her? But despite all my doubts, I forced myself to keep going. I tried to be helpful, even though there was almost nothing left of me. All my energy was focused on doing what I could in an atmosphere where every word and gesture felt like a part of the loss. Mom turned out to be surprisingly efficient in organizing everything, from food to flowers, managing the endless parade of well-wishers who came to offer their condolences. The funeral itself was like a blurred stain in my memory, vague images of people I barely knew, approaching with tight smiles, shaking their heads silently, as if their condolences were something habitual, automatic. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening, and it seemed I couldn't even believe that all of this had occurred. Linda stayed close by, occasionally touching my hand, which, I thought, was meant to be a comforting gesture. But in reality, it felt strange, this sudden maternal presence after so many years of neglect. I didn't know how to respond to her care, and perhaps I couldn't forgive everything she had done. After the service, when people began to leave the cemetery, Linda approached me again. I heard her voice, and there was something new in it that made me wary. "Tara," she began, holding back and sounding somewhat nervous, "I know this might not be the best time, but I'd like to stay in touch. Maybe we could have coffee sometime." I froze, unsure of what to say. This woman, who had once made my childhood a living hell, was now standing before me as if nothing had ever come between us. She was so glad to see me, but at the same time, I felt an underlying hope in her words, almost desperation. In that moment, I couldn't accept the closeness she was offering, but I also knew she was the only family I had left. I looked at her, and inside, everything was boiling with resentment and doubt. Maybe it was wrong, but I couldn't reject the offer outright. Maybe I really should think about it. Finally, I spoke, not very confidently. "Okay, I'll think about it." To my surprise, Linda held back her joy. She didn't immediately insist or try to say anything more. She simply nodded, and I saw a certain relief in her eyes. There was no triumphant joy, no expectation, as if she suddenly realized this wasn't the right moment for persistence. Despite my initial doubts, the maternal attachment began to weaken my defenses against common sense. With each passing day, it became harder not to give in to the soft pressure she had started to exert on me. I began offering small financial help, at first, little things, like assisting Thomas with his SAT prep courses, then buying Linda a new laptop when hers broke down. Soon, I was covering the monthly rent after Richard's company, as predicted, went bankrupt. "It's a tough time, you're an angel, Tara," Linda would say, with exaggerated gratitude, as if I were saving their lives. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Every time I heard these words, warmth spread through my chest, and for a moment, I believed that this was what real family happiness looked like. Perhaps I naively thought I could make up for all the years I had lost and even build something real, something genuine. But all of it was just a temporary illusion, covering up the complex and painful questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. At that time, I threw myself into work. Dad's company was going through tough times, but I still took the reins, making his longtime deputy the new director while I remained the owner, keeping the final say on all important decisions. It wasn't an easy job, and I'll admit, I felt much closer to Dad when I was sitting in his old office, surrounded by his papers and the familiar atmosphere. It felt like my way of continuing his legacy, even in his absence. But as time passed, Linda's requests became more frequent. What had started as occasional help soon turned into regular expectations. Each of her words, every request, became more demanding, and I felt my strength starting to drain. The turning point came on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. I was immersed in quarterly reports when my phone suddenly rang. Her voice came through on the other end, sweet and confident, as always. "Tara, darling," she began, "we were thinking that so much time has passed since we'd had a real family vacation. We found this amazing package for a European tour." I felt my stomach drop. My mind immediately began calculating, but before I could say a word, she interrupted me. "After everything we've been through, don't you think we deserve a little happiness?" In her words, I caught a trace of resentment, but also a hidden vulnerability. It was both manipulative and sincere. And before I could fully process what was happening, I had already agreed to finance their trip. I just couldn't find the strength to say no. But that wasn't the end of the story. The next day, when Linda and Thomas returned from their vacation, I realized that for them, it had become something much more than just a getaway. When the opportunity came up to go on a business trip abroad for a month, I seized it like a lifeline. I needed a break, a chance to clear my head, to get away from everything that had been weighing on me these past few months. The moment I sat on the plane, I felt the burden that had been pressing on my shoulders for so long finally start to lift. Maybe this was exactly what I needed, some time and distance, to figure things out, to give myself a chance to recharge. The month abroad flew by quickly, but it was exhausting. I lived in eager anticipation of returning home, kicking off my shoes, relaxing in my apartment, and feeling safe again. This was a space I had created for myself, a place where I could be alone, where every inspiration and decision belonged to me. But when I finally turned the key in the lock and stepped inside, something was wrong. Could I have been mistaken? No, that couldn't be. I pressed my palm to the wall as I entered the room and saw an unfamiliar, foreign atmosphere. The furniture I had carefully chosen was gone, replaced by strange, foreign decor. The air was filled with the scent of other people, and in the middle of my living room sat a couple, who, upon seeing me, stood up from the couch with such wide eyes that it seemed as if they had never seen me before. "Who are you?" the woman asked, clearly bewildered. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I stood there, unable to comprehend what was happening. This was my apartment. I couldn't understand how this could have happened. Panic started to rise. I demanded sharply, "What are you doing in my apartment?" The man standing beside her looked embarrassed and replied, "This is our apartment. We bought it a couple of weeks ago from a woman named Linda." The world around me seemed to flip upside down. Linda, my mother? No, this couldn't be. I couldn't believe it. My voice trembled as I responded, "No, this can't be. There must be some mistake. I never sold this apartment." The concerned couple exchanged glances. The man tried to calm me down. "We have all the paperwork," he said. "Maybe you should talk to your realtor." But my thoughts were spinning. I couldn't make sense of it. I felt like the world was unraveling, and all I needed was an answer. But my first instinct was to call the police, report fraud. But then, a quieter voice took over. I needed to talk to my mother. I had to hear it from her. This couldn't be true. It just couldn't. With trembling fingers, I dialed Linda's number, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The phone rang once, twice. Then her familiar voice, the one I hadn't heard in so long but which now felt so foreign to me, answered. "Hi, Tara, how was your trip?" For a moment, all my strength left me, and I nearly shouted into the phone. "Stop, Mom," I almost growled. "What have you done? Why did you sell my apartment?" She went silent. The silence stretched on so long that it felt like it lasted an eternity. And only when she finally spoke did her voice sound strange. Too calm. Too sweet. "Tara," she said, and there wasn't the slightest hint of an apology in her voice. "You know, I tried to do the right thing. Richard and I, we needed this. You understand, don't you?" Richard began pulling out financial statements, credit card bills, and bank statements. All of it painted a horrifying picture. Linda, my mother, had secretly taken out loans, hiding them from everyone, and now she was drowning in debt. I had no idea what was going on, and when Richard whispered to me, looking stunned, about what had happened, I felt the ground slip out from under me. We had both been deceived. Me. Him. And probably the entire family, including Thomas. The extent of Linda's betrayal became glaringly clear, and I was struck by the dishonesty of it all. Everything I had ever believed in shattered into dust, like a house of cards. A cold resolve swept through me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was straightforward fraud, and I couldn't remain a victim any longer. Without hesitation, I called emergency services, feeling the weight finally lift from my shoulders. I was no longer a passive observer in this nightmare. My mother had become a criminal. The following weeks became a true trial. The investigation was brutal but necessary. Each canceled transaction revealed even more lies. She hadn't just forged my signature to sell my apartment, she had been leading a completely double life. The credit reports showed extravagant purchases, huge spending on designer clothes, luxury spa treatments, 5-star hotels. And all of it, hidden from Richard, hidden from everyone. Everything was financed through a web of lies and secret loans that she had taken out with no intention of ever paying them back. The trial became a media circus. Reporters, like predators, set up camp outside the courthouse, waiting for every new twist in the case. Hungry for details and sensation, they surrounded me as soon as I left the building, capturing every move I made. I hated the attention, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite all the humiliation, I was watching the carefully constructed image of my mother, the image of a flawless woman, finally crumble in the eyes of the public. In the end, justice prevailed. My mother was found guilty on all charges: fraud, forgery, financial crimes. The judge's words still echo in my mind, like a clap of thunder. "Mrs. Linda Harrison, your actions demonstrate a flagrant disregard for the law and a shocking betrayal." The judge spoke with such cold contempt that I felt my own strength begin to return. I listened to the condemnation, feeling no sympathy whatsoever for the woman who had once been my mother. But there was one thing I couldn't forget: how truly hard it must be for those who betray. Linda lost everything. Her reputation, her money, even the family that had once been ready to support her. And all of it was for a lie she had spun over the years. The trial became a point of no return. After the verdict, I no longer felt the weight of revenge or disappointment. Just emptiness. Because I knew, Despite everything she had done, she was still my mother, and I couldn't forget that she had once been someone I loved. But there was no room left for regret. Justice had been served, and I began to rebuild my life.